Welcome to another episode of the 1994 podcast. I am Marcus Blake with That Nerd Show,
Alex Moore with That Nerd Show.
and we are on episode 4. And we've got kind of a fun movie that we're discussing from 1994, Maverick, directed by Richard Donner, starring Mel Gibson, James Garner, and Jodie Foster, in a lot of kind of ridiculous cameos, which we're going to get into. Here was my first impression of this movie, getting right into it. Early 90s, for those that don't really remember, that was the time we got away from more comedic westerns. Like, we started doing more serious westerns. Unforgiven had come out a couple of years before and won Best Picture. It was a great character study, of a former villain who, kind of reformed his life. Tombstone is kind of dark. And Wyatt Earp, the other Western that came out in 94, is, kind of a dark movie as well. I mean, it's kind of tragic, and as you explore Wyatt Earp's life. But here we had this really fun, comedic, action-oriented Western that, in some ways was like a Western version of Lethal Weapon and Richard Donner. And for whatever reason, it really worked. And there's a lot of great nods to the early TV series starring James Garner, who played Brett Maverick. So yeah, it's just kind of off the wall for what, and a little bit different than what they were doing with Westerns back in the early 90s. Now, this is one of your favorite films of 1994, right?
It's up there. It would take a long time to really think about the rating system and where it would fit in, but it's a very solid movie.
Yeah, I don't disagree. Having rewatched it, there's a lot that I love about this movie. Uh, you really can't go wrong as just kind of it's a fun comedic Western. It doesn't have to take itself too seriously. And you have a phenomenal cast. So what is it that you really loved about this movie? Because as you were telling me before we started recording this show, you watched it a lot when you were in junior high.
Yeah, it was on one of those cable channels around the clock. Back then there was Cinemax, HBO, and Showtime, and I guess maybe the movie channel as well, and Encore. And they just kind of had a rotation of sort of a handful of movies that were all kind of from the same year, the same time period. And at certain times of the day, you could expect to see certain movies. And for a while there, kind of around 1996, 1995, Maverick was on all the time. I don't know which channel it was. I think it may have been HBO, but it was on a lot, and I rewatched it a lot. I still like to rewatch the movies I like, so not much has changed in that regard. But um, I think, to me, I guess what I like so much about it is that you kind of mentioned how it pays homage to a lot of the old westerns that were on TV, years before that. But it seems to be sort of poking fun at the genre a little bit, I think. So it is very funny in that way. But nobody who I knew that was a fan of the old westerns, like my grandfather, who was a huge fan of westerns, nobody was bothered by that. They all went and saw it, and they all really enjoyed it. So,
Well, for anybody that's ever watched the original Maverick show with Jack Kelly and James Garner, uh, fun little fact, it started off as kind of a serious show, but it was James Garner and Jack Kelly that kind of made it more comedic. And part of that is, I was doing some research about that show and this and stuff. I found this interesting that uh, to cut cost and get around corners of having to do, very complicated fight scenes, they would do stuff like dive in the weeds, and then somebody would dive out of the weeds, and so you weren't really seeing the fight. And the directors and the producers kept making it more comedic as the show went on.
Okay.
You know, I mean, but it didn't. It wasn't a serious Western at the time or character study like Rawhide to begin with, because you're dealing with gamblers who that's just how they live their life and how they the messes they got into. And um you know, I think there was one episode where Brett is running for mayor. It just it was kind of in that style, just that fun. Don't take yourself too seriously. We're just going to entertain you with and kind of show you this glamorous life of gamblers and the adventures they get into. And I think that's what this movie does as well, is for another generation of, hey, here is how it used to be. Because I mean, this movie was made, what, 35 years after that show premiered. So anyway, I kind of agree with you. I mean, I've never heard anybody really talk bad about this movie like it's not a good Western. I think it's a good Western. I just think it's done in a different style outside of what they were doing at the time with Unforgiven, Tombstone, and
Dance Wolves, yeah, even as far as
see, there's a great debate. Is Dances Wolves a Western? Like, well, it kind of is. Yes.
it doesn't take place in quite the same era as most Westerns do, but I guess most people kind of lump it in because of when it was released. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, you have this great era of getting back to doing Western movies. And I think that really kind of started with Silverado, back
and
in the.
there was actually another great comedy Western in the late 80s called Rhapsody in Love with Tom Berenger and
Yes.
what's his
Wow. I
name?
forgot about that.
Andy Griffith, that I thought was actually really funny, that I saw when I was a kid. So when I saw Maverick, I think it kind of reminded me of that because it was really funny and it was actually a pretty decent Western. So
Well, I mean, you look at these old shows or whatever, you couldn't get too dark because it was national TV. I mean, we're still talking an era where it was controversial for the I Love Lucy show, where you couldn't have two beds together and have them sleeping in, you know.
yeah,
So you kind of had to make it more family friendly and stuff like that. I mean, if you tried to make a Western like Unforgiven, well, even now, that's probably not going to be on TV. That's going to be on a streaming channel. So, uh, but yeah, Maverick is just that great homage to family friendly comedic Westerns of a bygone era. Um, one thing I didn't realize until I went back and watched it was that Richard Donner directed this movie.
uh-huh.
Um, so here's my first question. I made the comparison earlier that it's like kind of like the Lethal Weapon of, of westerns. Do you feel like that's kind of accurate? I mean, you get the right amount of action, comedy.
I think in some ways it is, and it's easy to say that because you have, you know, Mel Gibson as the leading man, and you have the funny cameo by Danny Glover that, if you've seen any of the Lethal Weapon movies and you see the interaction, you hear the line he says as he's trailing away. It's a really great recall. But Richard Donner pulled a lot of strings when they were making this movie because he brought back so many actors from movies he directed over the years. Margot Kidder, I mean, she
I
was so
know.
funny and uncredited. A lot of them went uncredited, but they were all
I
so.
absolutely forgot about that, and I kept looking when they were talking to the missioners, like, wait a minute, is that Lois Lane? I had totally forgot. And then of course Danny Glover and the bank robber scene.
And Corey Feldman was one of the bank robbers, but you don't ever see him. You don't
Yeah,
actually without the mask, but he was one of the guys in the mask.
yeah. And if you're trying to figure out which Richard Donner films we're talking about, let's see. We just mentioned Superman, Lethal Weapon, and
The
what was
Goonies.
that? Yeah,
Yeah.
the Donner film with Corey Feldman. Come on, people. Pop quiz. If you're a nerd, you should know me. That's right. We're talking about the Goonies.
Right.
Um, here, okay. I found this very interesting, and I think this would have completely changed the film. James Garner was not originally meant to be in this film.
That's really surprising to me, actually.
Well, it was actually Paul Newman who was
Right.
going to role, and they couldn't work out. The studio didn't want to pay his asking prices. What really led to him not doing it, but he loved the script and really wanted to do it. And then James Gardner came along as as a nod to the original series, which I thought was
Yeah.
yeah. So do you feel like Paul Newman being in this movie would have completely changed it?
He was a really good actor. It's hard to say. Having James Garner was kind of like the icing on the cake, though.
Yeah.
And it's when I read that Paul Newman was the original guy, it kind of surprised me because it just seemed like such an obvious choice to have James Garner in there, playing a different character. And you hear Maverick making references where he says, "My old pappy used to say this." You kind of see him rolling his eyes or kind of biting his tongue, and eventually find out who his real dad is. But
Yeah.
I don't know if Paul Newman could have pulled that off because he wasn't Maverick like James Garner was. So
Well,
it
okay.
kind of
First of
makes sense.
all, I love every time he says like my daddy used to say, which is another great nod to the show because that was a kind of a reoccurring joke about the original show. But here's the thing: if Paul Newman had been in this movie, would we have believed him as the elder Maverick? Considering we recognize him from Butch and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Could we separate those two? I don't think audiences really could. I mean, Paul Newman is great, but that's all we're going to see.
Yeah.
Butch Cassidy, and that's too widely. I mean, and I'm not saying anything against Paul Newman. I mean, great comedic actor, um, absolutely. And we're going to get that. We're actually going to talk about one of his films from 1994. He didn't do this film, but he was in another great one called Nobody's Fool, which is a very underrated 1994 movie. All right. So I'm going to turn it over. Tell me some of the great, what you really love about this movie, like some of the best parts about this movie and why it's worth watching.
The first thing I noticed, especially when I watched it this last time, is that despite the fact that it was made 30 years ago, when you look at this movie, the cinematography is so good that it doesn't look like a movie that's 30 years old. It looked like it could have been released 20 years ago or 10 years ago. Some of these movies have such a good look to them and were so well made that they age very, very well. And I feel like this is one of those movies. And I didn't know much beforehand about the cinematographer, who's Vilmos Zsigmond, but this is a guy who had a very good career as a cinematographer. He did Close Encounters, Deer Hunter, Blowout. This
Yeah.
guy knew what he was doing when he shot this movie, and he gave it a really good touch.
Well, the whole scene and when they're, traveling through the West and they're dealing with
Mhm.
Indian missionaries. And I love the scene. Actually, my favorite scene in the movie is when he's trying to get his $1,000 from his friend Joseph, who doesn't have it, and they're conning the Duke.
Graham Greene, the legend.
Graham Greene's got his own separate con going on with the Duke, but it all comes back around when they need that extra money, and he finds them,
Right.
Indian affairs.
That was silly son of a bitch. Probably would have gone for 2,000. Oh no, that would have been pushing it.
Yeah.
And that's another example of something I love about this movie. Guys like, when you see Maverick and his friend Joseph interacting, it's like it's not like they're in a Western, but they're just talking like guys
Yeah.
in America now today. You know, Joseph is very unassuming. You see him at first when he's sort of parading as a dangerous Native American to try and get his friend away from the other people, but he's just an average, everyday guy like Maverick is.
Here's a great thing about I want to say this about Graham Greene.
Yeah.
Every role that Graham Greene had had up to that point, especially playing an Indian, was a very serious role. Uh, Dances with Wolves, uh, well, Thunderheart, the Val Kilmer movie about the reservation, which came out like in the late 80s. Um, he's kind of comedic, but there's a serious tone. You don't get to see Graham Greene kind of be a con artist, be the funny guy and stuff. And he is incredibly funny.
Yeah.
I was remarking about his performance. I mean, just kind of the dry sense of humor. He had the great cameo in the Taylor Sheridan series, 1883. He
Hmm.
played the Indian that helps um, seal the womb of the daughter as she's dying, from the arrow and everything. And he's the one that points to where they go. That's actually going to become the Yellowstone Ranch. But he has this great line in there. It's like, I'll give you a place, but just know that in 7 generations, my family will rise up and take it back. It's just um they're I think sometimes Native American actors they get locked into certain roles of like how it's supposed to be. Wes Tootie is another great example because first time we're introduced to Wes Tootie as a Native American is Last of the Mohicans, and he's basically a villain. But but also we know Wes Tootie now as this great comedic actor because one of our favorite films is Mystery Men, and he has all these ridiculous Native American sayings as a superhero that it's just like this makes no sense, but he's hilarious.
Formulaic, it's a little formulaic, yeah,
Right,
philosophical conundrums.
right. But that's what I think makes Graham Greene fantastic in this film because it's a big departure from what he normally does. And of course, I mean, he's played villains and he played a villain on the show Longmire, which he was great at that. Um, but yeah, the whole like con. Here's another thing. Mel Gibson doing war paint, dressing up as an Indian. Could you even get away with that anymore in a movie?
That's a good point.
I think, I mean, of course, I don't think you can cancel Mel Gibson anymore. I mean, once you've argued with the drunken conversation and blamed it on the Jews and all that, and he's probably got that attitude. He's like, I don't really fucking care. I made The Passion of the Christ and made more money than most people doing this film, and now I'm about to go do it again. I'm untouchable. But we live in a world like, oh my God, he's putting Native American war paint on, and it's like you completely missed the point of this
Yeah.
great scene where they're trying to con a foreigner. It's like Blazing Saddles. That movie would never get made.
Right.
I'm surprised you're even allowed to play that movie anywhere anymore. Anyway, what are some other great things about Maverick for you?
I think I'd have to give some credit to the music as well. I mean, they were able to get a lot of country singers to. There aren't a lot of songs in the movie, but the ones they're well placed, and so you notice them when they play. And of course, Randy Newman, the great composer, has a song that plays during the end credits, and he did a great job writing the music for this movie and finding a good balance between the action and the comedy. So you're able to listen to it and not see it as a total farce. He found a really good balance for what he needed to do with the music in that movie.
Uh, the tempo of Randy Newman's music it seems to always be perfect for something that's comedic and lighthearted.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to pay tribute to whether you're a country music fan or not. I mean, Clint Black wrote, the opening song for the movie and the one that, plays at the credits. but he also has that great cameo as the first guy that gets caught cheating and they throw off the riverboat.
Yeah, I never noticed this before until I watched it recently. When he's thrown off the deck, he's yodeling as he's thrown off, and he's saying, "I can't swim," but he sounds like Hank Williams. And I wondered if he did that on purpose to pay tribute to another country singer. It was really strange how his voice sounded. It was like that sounds like Hank Williams when he's being thrown
Well,
off.
I mean, he does actually kind of sound like Hank Williams. So you, you didn't really have to dub anything.
I guess.
But, great. Another two other great uh, cameos by country stars. We got Vince Gill in the movie. You had Waylon Jennings,
Mhm.
who are all.
McIntyre had a also had a very small cameo. It was uncredited. She's watching them gamble in the very first scene of the movie in the hotel or
Yeah.
wherever you call it. But also just hard to see it. But they had to cut some stuff out with some other great cameo roles too. The movie was already over 2 hours, but
Well,
it's an
let's
embarrassment.
talk about for those of our parents and our grandfather's generation, the great cameos that you had. First one goes to Lee Gordon, who plays one of the poker players in the first card scene. He wrote 4 episodes of Maverick.
Mm-hmm.
As for TV stars, here's who you have that play in the poker tournament. You've got Denver Pyle. Now, if you don't know who Denver Pyle is, you are obviously not born in the 70s or in the 80s. But for you young people out there, he is the original Uncle Jesse from the Dukes of Hazzard. But he had a long Western career. Um, he a lot of great John Wayne movies like The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Uh, but anyway, he also played in another great show called The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp. That's for him. William Smith from Laredo, Doug McClure and James Drury from The Virginian, Henry Darrow from The High Chaparral.
Chaparral. Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Robert Fuller from Wagon Train and Laramie. So all of these old TV Western stars kind of make up.
I do want to mention one more that I think maybe gets overlooked a little bit because it wasn't a big Western show, but he was in it, and he was a great character actor and mostly did TV. His name was Dennis Fimple, and he plays this. They call him the stuttering gambler, I think, in the movie, and he's the guy who, when they're getting their shots at the table, he drinks milk, which kind of stands out. And at
Yeah,
the very end, he's going against James Coburn, and he loses, and he starts crying at the table like a little baby. And I thought that was so funny because you just didn't expect it. But I'm sorry, I'm having trouble remembering what the show was, but he was apparently also in a western for a few episodes at some point as well.
well, a lot of these guys, did Western shows. I mean,
Yeah,
Harrison Ford did like 3 or 4 like episodes of Gunsmoke playing various villains. In fact, you want a fun fact about Harrison Ford, his the scar he has on his chin came from mishandling of a gun, and he actually knocked out 2 of his teeth. You know, doing that. So it's not unheard of a lot of great actors to get started and stuff. Here's a great one, and this is I don't think. I mean, you really have to know your classic westerns to get this cameo. Paul Bringar, the stagecoach driver who dies, he
yeah,
plays Wishbone, the cook who drives the wagon train on Rawhide with Clint Eastwood.
yeah.
So,
This was his last movie before he died, or very, very close to it, because I think he died in 1995. So it was
well,
kind of
yeah,
go out.
that was also the final film of Leo Gordon. It was the final film of Denver Pyle. Um,
That's
final
what I mean.
film.
They were able to get a lot of big names, a lot of good names in this movie, and that was impressive.
Well, yeah, there's just uh oh, Linda Hunt, Clint Walker both had cameo roles in this film. Hunt plays
It was
Walker
right.
plays.
Well, I think Linda Hunt was cut out. She plays a role where she's a magician and
Yeah,
tells Mel Gibson he's got the magic touch, and they had to cut it out, unfortunately. And
yeah.
that's unfortunate because she was great.
Well,
She's great.
yeah, there is a director's cut out there where you can
I
see a
need.
lot.
I haven't seen that. Yeah.
Um, so I don't, when I look at this film and as I've rewatched it, to me, it's kind of like a precursor to Ocean's 11. So hear me out on my theory. Ocean's 11, when George Clooney decided to remake the Rat Pack movie, it's a heist movie. It's a con movie. That's essentially what this is because they're all trying to con each other. Jodie Foster's character, Annabelle, she's just a con artist that hasn't really learned. And the funniest scene regarding her is she's trying to learn and she's trying to keep up with everybody. And when she gets put out of the game, she's like, I didn't show any tails. I didn't wiggle my hand. And he's like, you paused in your breathing. And then everybody around the table, yeah, you did.
And she's like, "How did you?" And then she realizes where he learned that from. So even it was like he was conning the con artist,
Yeah.
so the whole time. Right.
Well, and Afro Molina, another great actor who is hilarious
Yeah.
and playing a great villain. Um,
He scared me when I was a kid when I saw this movie. I thought he was really intimidating in this movie.
I can see that, but no, I look at this movie as it's a con movie. It's a Western con movie. So it's kind of in the same vein as like Ocean's 11, because you don't really know who to trust. If you watch that movie for the first time, like, I mean, you automatically know that you can't trust Annabelle. Okay.
Mhm.
And you know that Maverick is up to something, but you don't realize you don't, there's nothing that really shows that James Garner, who plays Zane, is his dad. You don't understand, you don't really realize James Colburn's the Commodore. It, it Everybody's just trying to con each other to get to this game, to win all this money. And even then, you may not, whoever's going to end up with the money, because someone you've pretty much set the stage that someone's going to try and steal it, type thing. So on the surface, it feels like a Western gambling movie, but I feel like more, it's a heist movie. It's a con movie below that. You think I'm wrong in looking at it that way?
No, not really. Yeah, once you've seen it the first time and you go back and rewatch it, and then you can kind of see how everything fits together. And there's even a moment where when Maverick sees a Cooper for the first time and just says, "Remove your hand from a lady," he kind of gives him this look, and he's got a little bit of a gleam in his eye, like, "Oh, hey, Dad." Like, so it's like the whole thing was kind of planned. They knew they were going to meet each other at some point and move on, but um, they couldn't let on anything else. But then, of
Well,
course, you find out that Annabelle kind of knew all along at the end of this,
yeah,
um,
she kind of figured out there was something, between them.
with some great suggestive remarks as well.
But then again, I mean, spoiler alert here if you haven't watched it,
Yeah.
I love at the end where okay. I'm going to preface this. Why does everybody steal a bag without checking the bag that you're stealing? I mean, you didn't count it, you didn't look at it. It's like you've spent this entire story trying to con each other, and you're just going to walk away with the bag and the money's in the boot all along, type thing. Um, anyway, so some interesting other fun facts, related to the show. The show featured brothers, and whose point of view was going to be in each episode, and then they introduced like a cousin, Beauregard Maverick, actually played by Sir Roger Moore. Before he went on to do well, I think he was actually doing the Saint series at the time as well. Um, Sean Connery was actually offered that role, and Roger Moore became the secondary choice. So that's the first time that he takes over of something that Sean Connery was going to do and all that, and then the second one being James Bond. So what I'm actually leading to is that when we are introduced to the Maverick brothers, we see them in the movie, Wyatt Earp, okay, and how they, relate to Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday and stuff like that. If this film was really just told, it's a father and son kind of heist comedy more than anything else. Do you feel like that works better as a story, or if you had introduced Bart, which, by the way, I do love the little jokes about they can't get Annabelle can't get his name right. She keeps calling him Bart, which is the other brother.
Yeah.
You feel like having a brother in that movie takes away from the overall story?
Yeah, it was already so crowded as it was, and they had to cut so much as it was. So it's hard for me to imagine having another major character. I mean, if he was in there, that would have had been a very small role. And I guess it's possible it may have been included. I mean, William Goldman would know. I mean, but I mean, he, by the way, phenomenal screenwriter, one of the best. So the fact that they got William Goldman to write this screenplay was amazing too. But um, yeah, I honestly think the references to that character were enough. Uh, Obviously, a nod to the show, but it's hard for me to imagine having yet another character in there taking up any more screen time. So
Yeah, I see. I think focusing on one was always is better because you kind of had the show kind of get overcrowded at times too. Like one episode would be from one brother's point of view, where the other one would be the secondary character. So you're kind of switching off here and there, and you give a chance to focus on just these characters and the adventure and all that. Um, Even though you don't really know much about Zane Cooper and obviously that's probably not his real name,
right.
but you kind of that father son um, experience more than anything else. And I think to me that's a lot better because this is kind of a generational movie. You have an older audience who watched the show, got to do this movie, and then you have our generation, which is not really familiar with the show, who gets introduced to this character, so to speak, in this movie. And I believe Maverick actually came out before Wyatt Earp. So you're talking about pop culture. Unless you really knew westerns, this is how you're kind of first introduced to Brett Maverick. All right, here's a question. Kind of a reoccurring theme with That Nerd Show. We talk about TV shows that have been turned into movies and vice versa. So we're centering on movies or TV shows that get turned into movies. We've had Miami Vice got turned into a Michael Mann film, which I actually kind of like that movie. Very Michael Mann. The Broken Lizard Club turns Dukes of Hazzard into a movie, love it or hate it. So here is William Goldman and Richard Donner taking an old Western and turning it into a movie. Compared to other stuff in the past, how does this favor compared to the series? Does it work as a movie, or should it have remained a series? Because here, let's keep this in mind. They actually tried to reboot the Maverick series in the late 80s, 20 years after the show had ended with James Garner, and it only lasted one season.
And that may have been why they, I mean, it's easy to say in hindsight that it works as a movie because it it was good, and it was, I guess we call like a sleeper hit. It was made on a budget of 75 million and earned 183 million, so it did well. That is a little bit of a big budget, but they had a lot to do in this movie, so it makes sense. Um, I Sometimes in hindsight, it just doesn't make sense to do it a different way. It's kind of like when you find out that Jurassic Park and ER were once supposed to be switched. ER was going to be a movie, and Jurassic Park was going to be a series. Like, no way. There's no way it worked. Jurassic Park is the movie, ER is the show. Duh.
Right.
But it's easy to say that in hindsight. So,
well, I don't even know how you would even make a series like Jurassic Park. I mean,
that was the plan originally, but obviously they made the right choice. So,
I guess the pilot episode of ER could serve as a movie. It was 2 hours long and it was kind of cool. But yeah, you don't really get to know these characters in one episode and how they all interact and all that. It has to be done in a series. So here's my take on it. I am not a fan of the Dukes of Hazzard movie. I'm really not. There's some highlights. Obviously Willie Nelson is a great Uncle Jesse. Really the highlights of that movie are three things. I was talking with Daniel Durrett of Real News about this. Willie Nelson and Burt Reynolds make that movie. Okay. Burt Reynolds as Boss Hog was great. Jessica Simpson, even though she's a terrible actress and can't act to save her life, was absolutely gorgeous in that movie, obviously. She did play a good Daisy Duke. And then, of course, I love Kevin Heffernan from Broken Lizard Club as Sheath, the conspiracy theory wearing armadillo guy. There's some funny stuff. Other than that, the series is always going to be better because you have these misadventures from week to week. I say the same thing about Miami Vice. I like that movie as a Michael Mann movie. Okay. Good cast, well acted. But the show is so iconic and incredible that you have 5 years, even when it started to get kind of stupid, you have these great cases and you get to know all of these characters over time. Okay. So I take that when I look at the movie Maverick. Yes, I think you could probably do a series, and the series is still classic today, 60 years later. But this is one adventure of an iconic character. To me, this is one of the better movies being adapted from a TV show that works because you don't overcomplicate the plot. It's simply just trying to get to a poker game, and everybody's trying to con each other, and you don't know who's going to come out on top. And it's funny as hell. That's how I look at it, because it's hard to adapt a TV show into a movie. I think it's a lot easier to adapt the story of a movie into a TV series when you can explore storylines beyond 2 hours. Okay. So anyway, that's my personal opinion. Agree or disagree?
I think it makes sense. Yeah. So I don't have anything to argue on that one.
Well, it just, for a good story, 2 hours, great cast, 30 years later, it still works as a fun movie. Um, and the cameos, really do work more than anything else. Um, and I don't know if you could ever capture that same magic again. I mean, now it would have to be a reboot, obviously, because James Garner has passed away, and Mel Gibson's too old. But if you tried, I don't know if you can appreciate the same silliness and comedic nature of these characters in the same way anymore in this day and age. But this movie still works, for what it is. Anyway, my opinion, um, for anybody that wants to agree or disagree. Okay. Uh, some of the fun facts about this movie. What are some other fun things that you love about Maverick?
Ooh, let me think. I know I had other I know I had some other things in mind before, but uh,
Um, I know now we're just kind of like drawing a blank. Maybe that's the sign that we've kind of talked enough about this movie. So here's a question. Julia Roberts and Michelle Pfeiffer were both up for the Annabelle role. Do you think either one of them would have
right,
been Jodie
yeah.
Foster?
I'm glad you brought that up because this is kind of what I was thinking about before. Who are some other people who could have played these roles? And the two of them I can't really picture. However, I was rewatching another movie with Mel Gibson that's also free on YouTube right now called What Women Want with the help with Helen Hunt.
Sure.
And somebody was leaving a comment on the Maverick YouTube page and mistakenly said Helen Hunt instead of Jodie Foster. You know what? Helen Hunt could have played this role. I think
Yeah.
she could have. Yeah, she would have been about
Well,
the right age. She's a great actress.
well, she was her fame at the time. The Mad About You, the show with Paul Reiser, which was a big hit for NBC. Um, can't disagree with that. Uh, I don't know. I can't really see Julia Roberts doing it, but I kind of see Michelle Pfeiffer. I mean, I do think Jodie Foster is kind of the perfect choice, and she's great in it. But Michelle Pfeiffer is very comedic and stuff. Um, if I had a different casting choice out of who was up for it, I would have picked Michelle Pfeiffer over Julia Roberts. So, I mean, I love Julia Roberts, but I don't, I can never see her in a Western.
At least not in that role. I mean, in a different kind of role, perhaps, but as that role, I just can't picture it. So,
Well, I just, I don't see her doing those period pieces. I mean, she's done, I mean, she did the Mary Riley movie. She was the housemaid dealing with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Um, she also played the love interest of Michael Collins, Michael Collins movie with Liam Neeson, um, in 1996. But no, I would just never see her do this movie.
I also thought a little bit about who else could have played this role besides Mel Gibson, and for whatever the reason, one of the guys that I thought of first was Tim Allen. I think Tim Allen could have pulled off that role as Brett Maverick, actually.
You know, wow. Kind of a dark horse candidate there. He was popular at the time with his show, Tool Time. Or wait, no. But it's not, wait a minute. Um, what was the name of the show? I'm thinking of the show within the show.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Wow, I'm drawing a blank on that. Anyway, his show on ABC where yeah. Um, I mean, I could kind of see that. Tim Allen is extremely funny.
Well, and
Um,
I think maybe part of the reason I can picture it is because he did a movie that sort of pokes fun at the Star Trek sci-fi genre and Galaxy Quest. And I kind of see it as kind of a similar role in a way. So it was Home Improvement that he was
Home
the show,
Improvement. Thank you.
right? So the show within it. Yeah.
I was thinking of the show. I mean, actually, you could have literally switched those titles around and it still would have worked. um, well, Galaxy Quest is just a classic movie to begin with.
Yeah.
I mean, I could what 20, it's the 25th anniversary of that movie, and I could watch that any day of the week. I could just throw it up in the background, and there's just nothing wrong about that movie. Um, but I don't know. I can't really think of anybody at that time that would have been better than Mel Gibson. I mean, Mel Gibson was really hot. He hadn't gone
Hmm.
completely crazy yet.
He had worked with Richard Donner before, so it made sense. His Lethal Weapon connections. I get that. And
Well, comedic action movie too. I think we were texting one night. I was talking about Bird on a Wire because it's on Netflix right now, and I recently rewatched that. And I'm like, that still stands up even today.
and you mentioned Harrison Ford. I mean, Harrison Ford may have been able to pull off a role like this too, I guess. I mean,
See,
he was a
I
little bit
don't
old, but I mean, he
know.
was
Okay.
still in shape. I mean,
Well, yes. So here, I love Harrison Ford. It's more of the dark comedy than anything else. Okay. But with that said, 15 years before, he did a Western called The Frisco Kid with Gene Wilder. Great, very underrated classic. I mean, he plays the bank robber escorting Gene Wilder, the rabbi, across the country to San Francisco. And they become best friends. And, he plays a very good straight man. Um, he's great in that, but he's also a little bit more serious. Okay. So I don't know if the right tone would have been made. I mean, it just Mel Gibson is just kind of perfect. Because there's okay, let's look at it this way. We're going to go back to Richard Donner. If you look at the Lethal Weapon movies, Danny Glover is the straight man compared to the comedic crazy guy of Mel Gibson. He's able to pull that off a lot more than what Danny Glover would have been able to do in his delivery. And I think that transfers over a lot in the movie Maverick. They say that timing is everything, and the way he delivers everything, the way that he does it, that's what made him so good in that movie Conspiracy Theory with Julia Roberts. Or, Bird on a Wire. There's been a lot of great movies that he has done where he's just kind of been that comedic, crazy guy, so to speak. And well, I'm losing my train of thought, but anyway, just can play the charming and lovable con
well,
artist.
how about a guy like what's his name from Inner Space?
Dennis Quaid,
Yeah,
you know,
he's a little
uh,
shorter, but I mean,
that that would have been interesting. I don't deny that. I mean, he had a very interesting take on Doc Holliday.
yeah,
No one's going to remember that because Val Kilmer was so awesome as Doc Holliday. That's
yeah,
something
can't
that's
beat
something
that.
we're going to talk about in another episode. But anyway, I don't know. I think you talk about hindsight. Yes, it's easy to look, well, he's perfect for it. But I think that's one casting choice that there's no debate
Oh, then
on.
yeah, there's no problem with any of the casting. I don't think. I mean, but at the same time, it's fun to kind of think, what if? Who else could have done this just for fun? Obviously, not because we had some problem with who was in these roles. So,
Um, well, and somebody who can hold their own with all of these classic actors, so to speak. I mean, him and James Garner, the way they interact with each other in this movie, I mean, there's a lot of great, chemistry. And in a lot of ways, James Gardner was very much like the Mel Gibson Riggs type of character in the original series. And let's face it, he's James Garner can play a lovable and charming con man. He pretty much did it from Maverick, the Rockford Files. I love him as the pilot in The Great Escape. So anyway, all right. So we're going to talk about how we rate this movie. Again, it's been one of our favorites from 1994. Still great to watch 30 years later. It's in. I feel like it stands the test of time. That's why we're talking about it. And it doesn't matter. It just doesn't feel like it was made in 1994, that it's 30 years old. So anyway, how would you grade this movie?
I didn't have to think about this one as much as say the Little Giants or Clerks. I think a 7 out of 10 is just at the right spot for this movie. It's not quite as important as a movie like Clerks in retrospect, and as far as changing the lands, what it did for its genre and so forth, and it's such a solidly made movie. But at the same time, you can't you got to be careful not to go too high and just say, well, fall in love with all the cameos, as fun as those are. But it's not much of a story, but I think it works greater as a comedy than it does as a western. But overall, solid movie.
All right. If we're comparing it to groundbreaking movies of 1994, and by the way, we're going to talk about a movie where Bruce Willis showed his penis. That's on our list because it actually is a good movie, and we're going to talk about that in another episode. However, if we're comparing it to the other groundbreaking movies or whatever, sure, I will give you that it's probably about a 7. But it's just a fun movie that I can enjoy and throw in the background or whatever. I would give it an 8. To me, it's good. It's funny. It doesn't. Everything works well in the movie, even with all of the cameos, the comedy, the cast. I know I enjoyed it 30 years ago. I enjoy it still. So it's kind of in that range for me. But again, if we're comparing it to groundbreaking movies like Clerks or Pulp Fiction or whatever, it probably is a 7. And I think that's what most people get. It's an okay movie that you can still go back and watch. It's more than adequate, but it's also not great. And I don't know, when you deal with comedies, I think sometimes it's hard to talk about what is a great comedy. That no matter what, it just works on all levels. I mean, I say Galaxy Quest is one of those. But it's hard to come to a comedy that absolutely hits everything perfectly. I mean, The Big Lebowski obviously does. Coen brothers usually nail it with their comedies. I mean, Raising Arizona is another one of those. So, I mean, I don't know. Is this movie as good as those? No, not really. But it still works.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's okay to good, but it's not a bad movie.
No, not at all.
So, very lovable movie, great cast, definitely one that everybody should go back and watch from 1994. And I think, I mean, if you really want to play a game, if you are a film and TV aficionado, do you know all the cameos in the movie without having to look it up? I admit that I didn't. I recognize it, but there's a lot of them like, that guy seems familiar, but I don't know where he's from. So anyway, I guess we're kind of in agreement about where this movie stands from 1994, but certainly definitely one of the better ones. All right. We're going to close this out. We will be back for future episodes talking about more movies, hidden gems, popular movies as we go throughout the year. But we'd love to hear your thoughts on the movie Maverick, starring Mel Gibson, James Garner, and Jodie Foster, and directed by Richard Donner. You can tweet us out at That Nerd Show. That is actually our Twitter handle, at That Nerd Show. Any final thoughts about Maverick?
I'm glad they didn't try to make a sequel 30 years later.
It's funny you say that. This is a movie that does not need a sequel. It doesn't, you don't need, it didn't really need a sequel then. I mean,
But there are other movies from that year, like Dumb and Dumber, that got a sequel that didn't need to be made. Just a cash
you,
grab. We need to stop seeing cash grabs.
um, I throw the sequel to Dumb and Dumber in the same category as Zoolander 2. Did not need to happen. If the cast just wanted to get together and party on someone's dime, do a convention. Don't make don't make a shitty movie. I mean, that's like the equivalent of like, you know what? What's Billy Madison doing 30 years later? Let's check him out. Let's see if he has kids now. And like, no, we don't need that. Although you probably don't need a sequel to Tommy Boy, but if Chris Farley was still alive, I'd be like, you know what? That one I might watch because I still love Tommy Boy. Yeah. Hey. All right. Thanks for watching this latest episode. We are out of here. It's time to say goodbye.
I do.